Hello, my name is Gaëtan Klein. I am a certified pig state therapist and member of the Institute for the Study of Pig States. And in this video today, we are going to talk about the psychology of conception. And this is a very important and foundational video if you want to understand the psychobiology models that we use in the Institute for the Study of Pig States, but also if you want to acquire knowledge about what is conception from a psychological point of view, if you're a psychotherapist or a psychologist, or if you're just interested in these topics. We're going to dive deep in what it is and what it means and how can we use it to deepen our understanding of who we are as human beings. So I'm very glad to give you this presentation today, so let's dive in. So in this presentation, we're going to talk about conception, which is one of the most important moments in our human existence, because that is when we really come to existence as a unique and complete being, physically and also psychologically or spiritually. And what we are specialized in the Institute is the study of pre-birth psychology and psychobiology. So how does our body and our psyche starts to function and gets created and evolve through all these developmental stages before we're born? Well, that's what we study, and conception is probably the most important event because that's when a lot of things come together and that's when we really start to become ourselves. Of course, there are other events that are really important before conception because the egg and the sperm have their own history, and also what happens after that. But conception is so rich, there's a lot of things to say about it from a psychological and biological point of view. So let's dive in. So from our understanding of developmental events before we're born, conception is perhaps one of the most important or the most important because that's when you become really you. And it's also an event that happens because there is a powerful drive that is biologically relevant and that is always present as an underlying drive in the human psyche. What do I mean by that? Well, if you're an egg or a sperm, imagine for a moment that you are, what do you want to do? Well, there's only one thing that you want to do. You want to move forward and meet your other half so you can become whole and you can live. Somehow it seems like the sperm and the egg has this understanding that is their mission, that is their goal. And if they don't reach that goal, then they're going to die, right? So it's a very, very powerful drive. It's something that is also driving human beings in general fashion because reproduction is one of our primal instincts. It's probably secondary to survival, but after survival, that's probably the most important drive. And that drive and the psychology of it is also something that is present throughout our whole lives, not only in our relationship with the people that we're going to fall in love with or have babies with, but also in our own psychology and our own relationships to ourselves. And we're also going to talk about peak states of consciousness and the spiritual side of it. So the psychology of conception is very deeply tied to the psychology of men and women. And sometimes I will call it manhood and womanhood. Sometimes I will talk more about masculinity and femininity because we all have both polarities in ourselves. And those polarities play out at conception because there's a part of us that comes from a mother and a part of us that comes from a father, right? So they come together, and when they do come together, they feel like male and female. And so this completion of coming together and merging is something that plays out not just only at conception, but throughout our whole life and throughout our whole relationship with men and women. We're also going to talk about the psychology of what is a quest and what is meaning? What is meaningful? How do we give meaning to our life? Very often we give meaning to our life with a quest. There is something we need to accomplish. And it turns out that this is something that is building up upon that first quest, that first drive that we have to come to become alive when we are a sperm or an egg, right? It's also something that is really important to understand the deep psychology of love and sex and intimacy and the sense of accomplishments that we can have in those domains. And of course, we're going to dive into spiritual elements at the end of this presentation too. So, conception is a journey of 1,000 steps. The journey to conception is loaded with potential stakes and traumas. And traumas in our definitions are anything like an emotional shock or an emotional negative experience, but also physical negative experiences. And from the moment where our parents start to meet and then to mate, to the moment where conception happens, there are many steps before that that are a huge journey for the egg and the sperm. If you think about it and you think about the size of a sperm, which is really tiny, and all the journey it has to go through to meet the egg, who also has its own journey, well, it's really a long journey. And there's many steps that can be misleading for both of them and dangerous and complicated. So it has a lot of stakes in terms of how am I going to accomplish this drive to meet and mate with my other half and merge with my other half. And it's really the hero's journey in a sense. So during mating, at the moment where our parents are, making love, and before conception happens, there is a signal that is sent to both the egg and the sperm, and they receive what we will call a life command. It's as if life is telling them, go now, it's time. You have to go and you will meet your other half. And that's when this drive is really set up, it's really triggered. It's extremely powerful because the egg and sperm cannot resist this drive. And actually, it's something that they want to do. It's something that is carrying a very strong psychological and spiritual charge. And because this journey is so long and so complicated, but also so important, it also has an effect on our life in general, and especially our dating life often replays those steps. And if there are traumas happening at conception and before conceptions, it's very likely that those traumas are going to be replayed in our dating life. Because our dating life is the coming of the masculine and the feminine together to, create a family, create a home, having babies, and so on and so on. So all these steps are also a replay of the 1,000 steps, from meeting each other, seduction, creating this couple harmony and this common goals in life. All of this replays all those different steps. So here's what happens. So when the sperm and the egg receive this life command, that's really the first part of conception, is the journey. So the egg is released from the ovary and it moves into the fallopian tube. And that in itself is a long journey. It feels like the egg is falling into that huge tunnel or funnel, and there are going to be different steps inside of that huge place to move through. And sometimes there are going to be some complications there. But it's even worse for the sperm, because the sperm itself has an even longer route to move onto. It has to go through the cervix, which is the opening of the uterus. It's a very narrow path, and then it has to move inside of the uterus and find which way to go. And just there are two different paths, right? The sperm has to choose. Do I go to the fallopian tube on the left or on the right? And of course, if he makes the wrong choice, he's going to die. But eventually, when the egg and the sperm meet each other, which is really a miracle of sorts, then fertilization happens, and that's when conception really starts. But the journey before that is also something that matters in the way that we experience dating and our relationship with the other sex. So let's talk about the sperm a little bit. To the released sperm, the whole mucosa is both a dangerous place and guides its path. So the vagina and the uterus both have fluids, especially when women are at the stage of the period where they can have a baby. They release a lot of fluids. And those fluids are meant to absorb and kind of pull up the sperm and take it into the fallopian tube. So we call it the mucosa because it's really a mucosic layer of fluids, and there are different fluids along the way, but they are guiding and pulling the sperm so that it can eventually meet the egg. However, mucosa can also be a dangerous place, and sometimes the egg get stuck. They can get stuck physically because they can stuck in places we call villi, and they can die there, or they can just not have enough strength and stamina to move forward to the end, etc., etc. Sometimes you have also pathogens in those fluids, and the sperm can get lost in there and not really be able to pull it towards the end. So here on this video, we have a replica of what happens to a sperm. So that's not a real in vitro video, it's a silicone model, but I find it very interesting to watch. So as you can see, the sperm can really get stuck here, and if it finds a place where it gets stuck into the womb wall or into the villi, which has those little dents that you can see here, well, sometimes it will not be able to get out of it and will stay there and die. So these are big traumas for the sperm, and we are human beings. We keep inside of us the memory of our own development, right? Our body remembers what happened to it before we're born. So these experiences that the sperm has to go through is something that we keep also inside of ourselves. And those moments can be traumatic. Generally, when those trauma happens, they are mostly emotional, and they are going to create worldviews and fixed negative beliefs based on those experiences. For example, the sperm can experience things like it's hard to be a man because you have so many efforts to do to reach the woman, right? That's a replica of what happens to the sperm memory. Or the path to success is hard. It's a long path, there's a lot of efforts to do, there's lots of obstacles, it's complicated, it's hard. So we can embody that belief in that experience in ourselves that started really in the womb. Or we can experience a lot of pressure. If I don't make it, I'm going to die. So we have a lot of pressure to be good man, for example, or to have success in the different projects that we have. Or other negative beliefs like access to women is difficult. It's difficult to seduce women, it's difficult to get to them, I don't know what to do. And a lot of young men are lost into what do they have to do to be a good person that will be accepted and loved and have success in their dating life, right? Or I have a lot of efforts to make in general in my life, or progress in life is strenuous, etc., etc. Something that also happens to the sperm is that it sees its brothers, let's say, die, right? Because there are millions of them that go at the same time, and only one of them make it to conception. So it explains that all these other brothers or part of his are going to die and fall and etc. So it's really stressful for the sperm. The sperm understands, if I don't make it, I'm really going to die. So I have to obey this urge that I have to move forward, but I also have to succeed. And how am I going to succeed? All these emotions can be stored in ourselves and play out in the way we experience ourselves, whether we're men or women, by the way. All right? Now, something that's really interesting is we can make a lot of parallels between the sperm experience and the psychology of sports. So in sports, we often have goals to score a goal. And many sports are about taking a ball and making the ball go into the goal. So we're trying to score the goal by taking the ball where it needs to be. And that's something that kind of echoes the idea that the sperm has to go to the egg. The sperm has to go in the right basket. It has to score the goal, right? And very often we have parallels between some things that happens in the psychology of sports and some things that happens at conception. For example, most people have the belief that the sperm moving forward to the egg is a competition between the sperm, that each sperm has to compete and only the strongest is going to make it. And that's actually not how it happens. It turns out that the sperm has a collective awareness. So all sperms, the millions of sperm, actually behave as a team. And their goal is not to individually win the competition. Actually, their goal is that one of them will reach the end. And it doesn't matter which one really, because it will be a victory if only one of them makes it to the egg and to conception. But there are generally traumas that block this perception of a team. So most people will have this misunderstanding about the psychology of sperm, and it turns out that it also plays out in how they see sport. So do you see sport as an individual competition when you have to be the best, or do you see sport as a team effort where you have to score the goal, and it doesn't matter who scores the goal? What's important is that the team wins. That's really a parallel between how the sperm experiences itself. Does the sperm feel alone, or does it feel related to its brothers? That's not the right term, but you know what I mean. And this relationship between men is also going to play out not just in sports, but in every team effort in general. So, you know, in business, in associations, in research, in many, many projects. So in the ideal situation when there is the less trauma possible, all the sperms would have a united consciousness. They would feel as a whole team, and there will be no competition, and the goal is that one of them makes it. And as I said, team sports often consist of getting the ball in the nest, right? So if you think about football, basketball, volleyball, even tennis, or many, many, many sports are a replay of this sequence of conception. And hitting the goal in itself is giving us a very strong sense of accomplishment. Why are people so interested in sport? Why do we watch sport? Why do we practice sport? Why do we have the Olympics games? It's because inside of us, the sense of victory and accomplishment that it gives us is something that is extremely deeply satisfying and powerful. Not just because it's a physical prowess and we can appreciate it, but because it's echoing with the deepest inner drives that we have to accomplish something in life. And one of the moments when we have to accomplish something that is very, very meaningful and important is when we are an egg or a sperm, right? So when we hit the goal, we demonstrate our personal value and we feel that we are accomplishing something, we are winning, and that's also linked to conception, right? Also, something that is really something really interesting to watch on the basis of how do men psychology works compared to women psychology, and it's something that's considered to be masculine for many people to have this drive for speed or for strong things or physical accomplishments and so on. And that also comes from the fact that the sperm has to go through a long journey and it has a lot of obstacles to reach the egg. So it's very, very often that we find traumas associated with the feeling of speed to be related to sperm memories, because the sperm has to go fast, right? And it has to go a long way. And people who have a lot of this drive for speed and movement and action are often replaying something that comes from the sperm memory. Now, it can be a problem or not. Sometimes it is a problem, for example, in the case of addictions. Some people are addicted to extreme sports or extreme movements and so on. And it's mostly men, not only, but mostly Why? Because men has a tendency to associate themselves with the sperm rather than the egg. We're going to come back to this. Now, that's the first step of conception. It's really the journey through the womb until the egg and the sperm meet. Now, when they do meet, there are many, many steps that happens before they actually touch. So the sperm sees the egg as its promised land. It's when the sperm arrive, you have to understand that the egg is much bigger than the sperm. And to the sperm, it feels like, wow, this is wonderful, this is amazing. And this is my goal, this is my promised land. And this is, the feeling of it is really a feeling of awe and wonder, and I want to go there. But also at the same time, it's intimidating because it's huge, it's powerful, it's also very often experienced as beautiful, right? The egg is white and round and it has this feminine side and it's really attractive to the sperm. So the sperm is like, wow, this is amazing, but it's so powerful. And somehow the egg starts to feel that to merge with the egg, it's going to go through a transformation that will be radical, right? Now, the sperm is the one who is moving in that sequence. In that sequence, the egg has arrived to the place where it's going to wait, and the sperm has to make the movement to go toward the egg. It feels like the sperm is making all the efforts here. It's not really the case. Both are actually moving, but it feels like the sperm has more obstacles to overcome, and it feels like there's other sperms around. So if the sperm considers the other sperm as competition, more pressure to him, right? Whether if it considers the other sperm as a team, it feels more empowered. And at this sequence, the main problems that we experience in terms of traumas is rejection. And it can be extremely strong for the sperm and extremely painful, because the sperm knows that if it's rejected, it's going to die. However, it does feel rejected most of the time in most people, and these feelings can be really extreme and really hard to face and to heal. And it's also something that we place in, of course, the psychology of dating. What is the most painful things that a man can experience in terms of emotion? Well, it's rejection from women most of the time. And that's why men are extremely afraid of this phase of seduction where they run the risk of being rejected. And it's physically painful because it replays those early traumas that can be extremely intense for the sperm. Now, it's also a trauma for the egg itself. So the egg actually recognizes and chooses one sperm specifically. From the point of view of the egg, it's like one of the sperm is lit, bright. And the sperm is going to say, wow, this is the one that I want. And the sperm is going to get pulled toward the egg because the egg also wants it. Both want each other, right? And the sperm has to exclude the other sperm. So for the other sperm, it's rejection to death, right? They're going to die. But for the egg, the big stake here is to choose the right one. It's to choose the sperm that carries the perfect genetic correspondence or completion, something that really matches the egg genetics. And for the egg, it's really important to make the right choice. It's also something that happens in the psychology of dating, right? Women has a tendency to be a little bit more passive and to watch the pretenders and then to choose the right one. And that for them, the big stake in the dating life is to pick the right one, right? When they don't, when they go with bad boys, for example, they experience difficulties afterward. But if they can pick the right one, then more chance of success in the later projects like creating a family, having a home, creating a life, etc., etc. So woman has a stronger drive to choose the right one, the right man, while man has a stronger drive to be able to seduce and not be rejected, and actually make it to the mating phase, right? So it's really a replay of conception. And it's also why we have this fantasy in our culture of the woman is waiting for the Prince Charming. Because from the point of view of the egg, the sperm is also wonderful and beautiful and masculine and strong and wow, look at that, it's so amazing, I want it. So there is this really romantic relationship between the sperm and the egg when they choose each other and when they go to the final phase of this approach, right? So the different styles that we play in seduction in our normal life are very often a replay of this phase. So if there are lots of traumas on this phase, it's going to be more difficult for us to experience a satisfying dating life because we're going to have fear of rejection, fear of not choosing the right person, or pressure, and many fears, and so on, because it's really a replay of that moment. If that moment doesn't happen peacefully and positively, then we carry the memory of, oh, mating is really difficult. And so that's why it's important to understand the parallel between the two. Now, as we move forward to the real start of the merging of the two pieces, there are going to be a lot of different sub-steps. The first one, which is really traumatic for most people, is a step that we call the hysteric screaming one. So as the egg and the sperm get closer, the egg often experiences a huge rage against the sperm and shouts what feels like a hysterical screaming. So it's really peculiar because when you are in regression and you experience yourself as the egg and you feel that the sperm is moving forward, there is this phase of intense rage and it feels like you're screaming, which it's a bit surprising because you know that as an egg you cannot really scream. But when you have this experience of being the egg at that moment, you really feel like, wow, you want to scream and you want to destroy the sperm in a way. So here you experience blame, rejection, anger, hurt, and all of these negative emotions from the point of view of the egg and the sperm. Because the sperm experiences, wow, this egg is huge, it's my goal, it's my promised land, that's what I want. But then it rejects me in such a strong and scary way that it's a big trauma for the sperm too. So when we want to heal that event, we have to heal it from the point of view of the sperm and of the egg. Even if you're a man, right? It's important to heal it and heal those emotions of rage and rejection. It's going to make it much easier for the rest of conception to happen. We don't really know to which extent it's important to heal that phase, but it's certainly something that makes it easier to work on the other steps of conception later on. It's also probably, from my understanding, one of the steps where we experience the drive to be people pleaser. It's not the only step, but it's definitely something that plays out in our relationship with the other sex. So people who have this tendency to be really submissive and people-pleasing, it's often because inside of them they carry the memory of this hysteric screaming that was so scary and that was so risky for them that we don't want to be rejected and we don't want to be blamed. We don't want people to be angry at us, because if they're angry and rejecting us, we might experience so much pain and we might even actually die, that we really don't want it to happen, so we prefer to be submissive. And very often in that step of conception, the sperm is more submissive and it's less moving forward. It's more waiting a little bit and submitting itself to how the egg is going to play its role in conception. So it's a very important thing to heal if you want to work on the other steps of conception, but it's hard. Now, let's do an exercise so you can start to understand the relationship between all of these theories that we just explored and how it relates to you and your own experience in life. So you can pause this video to do this exercise. Here are the 4 steps. The first step is I'm going to ask you to imagine, to close your eyes and imagine the ideal man or the ideal woman in front of you. And you're going to experience this ideal man or ideal woman with certain qualities, right? So maybe it's really strongly feminine or strongly masculine, or maybe it has certain qualities that you appreciate, and it should feel as if it's kind of glowing in beauty and very attractive. So that's a representation of the ideal man or the ideal woman. Now the next step is to imagine that he or her is getting closer to you. And ideally you should feel good. You should feel, oh wow, yes, I want that, and it feels great, and I feel a lot of energy and positive emotions, and it should feel good. Now, you can make him or her get so much closer that it actually touches you, and then you should feel great, and you might experience even strong sexual feelings or very strong positive emotions. And at the end, you should have the step of fusion. And ideally, in that step of fusion, when you merge with the ideal man or woman, you should feel amazing. Now, you can also do the reverse exercise, right? Because you can experience yourself as an ideal version of yourself in that exercise or not. And this exercise might trigger very strong positive emotions that you will intuitively know are connected to your goals in life, or some of your goals in life. Because it's a replay of that powerful drive and this quest, this meaning. Something that can also happen is that it will actually trigger negative emotions and traumas. And that's when you start to realize, oh, if I want to have this ideal man and woman relationship, those traumas are getting in the way. And those traumas are blocking me. For example, you might be extremely afraid. Or you might feel, oh, somehow I cannot make it come closer. It feels like it's never going to happen. And I feel alone and abandoned, or despair, or I feel a lot of tension. I feel like I'm going to disappear and die, etc., etc., etc. So those traumas can get triggered if you do this exercise. In that case, you can start healing those traumas if you know how to do. If you don't, then you can contact a therapist and we can work on it because you now understand how these traumas are playing out in your life, because they are going to play in your life if you want to have an ideal relationship with a man or woman. Right? So how do you feel when you do this? Let me know. And you can also note it down somewhere if you have a journal or something like that to take notes. Strong exercise, right? So now another version is to repeat this exercise by visualizing a man who could have been ideal but wasn't. What I mean by that is something from your life, something that you've been in a relationship with or that you are in a relationship with. And generally when we get romantic with somebody, it's because we see in that person the potential for being the ideal man or the ideal woman. Sometimes it's not completely realized, but it's something that is the underlying drive of our relationship and our connection with that person. But that person might not have been the ideal person in reality. So if you do this exercise with that person, it's even more likely to trigger traumas that came up in your dating life before and that might come up also in the future. So if you want a better life, especially if relationships are important to you, then it's a good idea to heal those traumas, right? For example, I was working with a woman and she said, I often have the same relationship with men. It's always the same thing. And I always find men who are hesitant or weak, especially when we are at the end of the seduction phase. And not just in the seduction phase, but in the whole relationship, they experience that when we get intimate, they become weak and hesitant. And so it was a replay of conception. Another client that I worked with said, men who cannot choose me make me fall into despair. And she often has this these phases where she was meeting a man and the relationship was going very well. There was a lot of attraction. But then moving forward in the seduction, something went wrong and the man left or finally didn't pursue this woman and so on. And she said they could not choose me for some reason. And she experienced despair. Now we track back this feeling of despair to a trauma in conception, and it was just replaying the conception where the sperm has a hard time choosing the egg and it was stuck for some time. And because it was stuck for so long and the conception was not happening, the egg started to feel despair as if it was going to fail in its strive to, merge with the sperm. So these experiences that we have in dating and in relationship can be really, really strongly identical to what happens to the sperm and the egg, right? Another woman told me, I'm looking for a man who is a conqueror. I'm looking for a strong man who is going to conquer me. And she rejected men who were not having this behavior because she thought, so the good one for me is a man who is going to conquer me. Even if he comes out as a little bit aggressive or dominant, that's actually what I like. And in that case, it was also replaying a trauma where there was a problem between the egg and the sperm really had to be strong and conquering, and it was painful for the egg to experience this. But it also was her conception. So the pain that the egg experiences as the egg enters the egg can be replayed in our relationship, where we want the same thing to happen. And what happens in our life, we don't play out the ideal situation, we play out the traumas because we play out what happened in conception. So if our conception was traumatic, our dating life is traumatic. And sometimes it's showing up as a very obviously negative way. Sometimes it looks like something like that. I want a man who is a conqueror. It doesn't seem to be very negative, but actually it also has problems in itself. And it's creating a conditioned, limited experience because the ideal man for that woman might not be a man who is a conqueror, right? Why do we have to be a conqueror? There's something a little bit too pushy and too conditioned and limited in that. So another exercise that I encourage you to do, which will help you to improve your life, your relationship life, is to really understand and really dive into yourself and feel what behavior and qualities do you expect from your partner. And by noting them down, by writing them, you are going to realize if you get those qualities in the person you're with or not, or if you're expecting for qualities that might not be ideal actually, like that lady who wanted to conquer a man. Is it really something that you really want to do, or is it just something that you're attracted to? And what behaviors and qualities do you experience in your partner or not? But what do you really want? What do you really expect? Another question to ask yourself is, what makes you afraid of rejection in relationship? So there are many ways in which people who are in a relationship are going to be intimate or close themselves off from each other. And very often we close ourselves to each other because we have this fear of intimacy. Because intimacy triggers those conception traumas. So rejection is a big one. For example, it's very common for many men to, when they have an argument with their partner, to kind of go into the cave and shut off and want to be alone and not to have to deal with that woman anymore. And they're kind of isolating themselves from the woman. So they're replaying the rejection part. They don't want to be rejected. It's too painful, so they prefer to shut down. Now, for the woman, it's very stressful to have a man behave that way because a woman doesn't have a lot of power in how the man is behaving and she wants things to be good, right? So if the man closes off from her, she will experience the despair of what the egg can go through, right? So we're replaying the trauma here. So what makes us afraid of rejection? And by understanding what triggers you and what also triggers your partner, You can communicate about it. You can understand that the other person is not closing off because they are rejecting you, but because they are trying to protect themselves from the very painful feelings that most human beings have, because most human beings have these traumas at conception. Another question that can be helpful if you want to find and treat relevant traumas is, what do you often blame the other person for? So what do you blame your partner for? What behavior or things that they say or way that they are that makes you really triggered? That's an indication that there is a trauma in yourself that makes you blame them, because blame is often an emotion that we play out because we try to control the other person, or we try to change them, or to signal to them, make them understand, I am in pain and I need you to behave differently. But instead of saying it positively, we blame them, right? So that's also a replay from the trauma. Now, at the end of this sequence of events, finally we have touchdown. So touchdown, when the egg and the sperm touches each other, is generally traumatic. It's traumatic because for many, many different reasons. So the sperm might come not at the right place. It might come too much upward or too much downward, not where it's optimal, and it can also crashes into the skin of the egg, which feels traumatic. It's like, bumping into each other. Sometimes the egg also has a reaction of becoming harder and kind of rejecting the sperm at that moment because it's too painful. So the egg is going to become harder, rejecting, and the sperm is going to feel rejected and feel, I'm there, but I cannot really get intimacy, right? Because I have this barrier between me and the egg. Now, what has to happen here is the egg has to open itself so that the sperm can penetrate the egg. So it's a replay of sex, right? So it's often traumatic because very often there is this pain in this moment. And when there is pain, the egg is going to make it harder for itself to open and to accept the sperm. And the sperm is sometimes going to make it harder by being more pushy, more aggressive. Because remember, the sperm has this very powerful drive. I have to mate. I have to merge with the other half, otherwise I die. So sometimes in obeying this drive, it becomes really aggressive, and that's a trauma for the egg. So on that moment, you can have different types of traumas that creates consequences in our sexual life. So I'm thinking about sexual disorders, for example, pain when having sex, or vaginism when it's difficult for the woman to open itself at all, or sexual disorders where the man is too early, or not feeling good, not feeling confident, and so on and so on. But also any kind of sexual disorders really can be tracked to this moment. It's not the only cause of sexual disorders. It's a bit more complex, but it's not rare to find that these problems are caused by memories from conception. Another thing that can happen that is also part of the trauma is the sperm can carry toxins and also pathogens. So the moment where the egg has to open itself, the sperm is not always a perfect, right one, the ideal charming prince. Sometimes it feels dirty or it feels negative in some way. Sometimes the sperm can carry like a negative atmosphere, I would say. So it feels like a bad boy, or it feels damaged in some way and the egg wants to take care of it, and so on and so on. So you can have a lot of different problems here that play out in how we choose our partners. And of course, it's one of the sources of immune disorders. Why? Because as the egg, you don't want to receive the pathogens, right? Because you know that they're bad, but you don't really have the choice because they come with the sperm. So if you want the sperm and if you don't want to die, then you have to accept it. So immune disorders can be tracked to that moment. It's the same thing in reverse for the sperm, actually. because the egg itself can also have pathogens. For example, the skin of the egg itself can be covered by a layer of mucus from any pathogens. So it feels toxic and disgusting and negative for the sperm. So the sperm can also experience traumas at this moment. And therefore, later on in life, the man can experience that women have something negative about them and something dangerous or dirty and so on and so on. So this negative judgment can be triggered by toxins and pathogens at touchdown. Now, very often we also have anger because the opening is not easy, so it can be either for the egg and the sperm. So we play it out later on in life as anger when it relates to intimacy with a partner. And when we feel that our partner is not available or capable of the deep intimacy that we crave, then we become really frustrated or angry, and so on and so on and so on. Now, at this moment, there's also a sense of validation, right? Especially for the sperm, because the sperm was chosen between many hundreds of other sperms. But also for the egg feels validated because it accomplished its goal, which is to find the other half. So there's a feeling of sexual validation that happens at that moment. And of course, if there are traumas, then there are going to be traumas in the way that we feel sexually validated, whether it's in the seduction phase or whether it's during sex, when we can also play out those difficulties in the intimacy, the physical intimacy. So if you want to have a better sex life, you might want to work on these events. So here's other examples of when things go wrong. So I myself had the experience of my egg not opening at touchdown and trying to push the sperm away. It was really peculiar because when I was taking the point of view of the egg, I feel disgusted and I can't accept that sperm. It's bad. It's not what I really want. So I was really pushing it away physically. Now, from the point of view of the sperm, that was really hard, right? It felt like, I cannot go inside. I'm being pushed aside. And it was really traumatic. So from the sperm side, the sperm side of the trauma was, I'll never be accepted. Oh my God, I feel so despaired and sad and I feel rejected. And it felt really painful. And the egg side of the trauma was, I cannot accept that. So I'm feeling disappointed, I'm feeling angry, but also resignated. I can't accept it, but that's all I have. And so my dating life, my relationship life is going to be wrong and full of despair and full of negativity. So this rejection between my two sides was actually playing out in my life and making me having troubles in my relationship. And so that's why I healed that. And going back to this experience was pretty interesting. Now, I'm very glad that I healed that because now, as I'm reading this, I wrote this a few weeks ago, actually. And as I'm reading this today, it's something that's really gone. It doesn't really exist in my life anymore. So that feels pretty good. Now, when the sperm enters inside of the egg, then you also have different steps once it's inside. So the first step that is really important from a developmental point of view is that the sperm loses its tail. So for the sperm, it's often traumatic. It feels like a part of you is dying when you are entering a real intimacy. And if you feel that this part of you is dying, then there's a feeling of dread about intimacy, right? And very often men have this subconscious idea that if they get real intimate with a woman, not just having sex, but real deep intimacy, then they're going to die and disappear. So they resist it, right? They resist having a full deep intimacy. So generally for the sperm, it's experienced as feeling of loss and death even, and it feels really dreadful and negative, and it's not easy. Now what happens to the to the tail, it's actually not destroyed. Actually, it's something that happens while the sperm is already inside the egg. So the egg is going to absorb the tail, and the tail is going to merge with the membrane of the egg, and it will be part of you and your being. It's not lost. But the moment where it's detached from the head of the sperm, it feels like a huge loss and a death moment. Now what happens after that is the sperm feels like a head, it's moving forward, and then as it gets closer to the core of the egg, the nuclear core, it has to open its head and release its genes and all of its biological material. So the moment where you do this as a sperm, you really feel that you're dying. And you really feel that you are losing your identity and that who you were as a man does not really matter anymore. Now, this is really traumatic, but healing this has very profound effects in the harmony that you will feel inside of yourself, but also with the other sex. I'm going to come back to this later on. Generally, the traumas that happen at that stage are, for the sperm, fear of intimacy, commitments equals death, right? Or I have to sacrifice everything for love. So if I really want to have love, I have to sacrifice so much. It's so painful. And I'm losing myself with women or things like that, or I'm losing my freedom. So if you have had relationship issues with fear of commitment, that might be coming from one of these traumas. Now, from the egg's point of view, you're really welcoming an intruder. That's one of the possible traumas. And you have to accept its flaws, because you have to accept that now it's here and those genes are going to be your genes. You're going to merge with it. So very often you have feelings of disappointment or negativity in some way, or sadness, etc. Or also being, for the egg, it can be a feeling of being corrupted in some way, transformed in a negative way. It feels like you are welcoming this inside of you and you are going to be, transformed by it. So that can be traumatic. And it's not rare to find feelings of inadequacy and disappointment, etc., etc. Now, before the genes merge, there is an event that I call the purity event. So it's really a very peculiar and really, really strong spiritual experience. So in that moment, the egg has the opportunity to clean itself and to purify itself from a lot of toxins and a lot of stuff that doesn't have to be there, and also some pathogens. And well, there's generally a lot of traumas on this moment, but when you hear those traumas, you can experience a feeling of purity. And I remember I did this years ago, and what I experienced is that suddenly me as an egg was becoming something much more pure and beautiful and bright, and I felt extremely good. But the sense of it, the experience of it was really to feel pure, but like I've never felt pure before. And there's also a transformation in the feeling of what it means to be feminine in that moment. And it reminded me of a spiritual archetype that we have, especially, in my culture, which is the Virgin Mary. And it really felt like in that moment, I was becoming a Virgin Mary. I was so pure, so benevolent. There was no negativity whatsoever. And I felt I only had positive emotions and positive thoughts. And I was white, glowy. There was a sense of holiness in that, and a lot of strength too. I felt strong, and I felt like I was embodying not the perfect woman, but the purest feminine experience that is possible. Now, unfortunately, that experience is generally temporary, but to experience it was really a very strong spiritual experience for me. And it just reminded me of the Virgin Mary, even though I'm not really, into religion at all. But I felt that this archetype of purity was really matching my experience at that moment. And that's not rare, that's actually pretty common that we find spiritual experiences in those developmental events. And I actually believe that most of our mythological and archetypal structures and ideas and concepts actually come from what happens before we're born and those specific moments. So the Virgin Mary, from my point of view, is an archetype that is coming from this experience. And people who talked about this archetype and created this myth of the Virgin Mary are people who, in my idea, were trying to recreate the perfect condition of conception. Because if you think about it, the Virgin Mary archetype is really about the feminine side of Immaculate Conception. And Immaculate Conception is a weird concept, right? Because it's life without man. So it's just God that impregnates a woman. And the woman that receives it is extremely pure. She's extremely good. She has no negativity in herself. So I think that it replays the fact that this event can happen when there is this complete cleaning of the egg, and it feels that conception is much, much, much better when you experience it this way. Now, it might be an important step for the beauty way state that is going to happen just afterward, but it's something that is pretty interesting to access. Now, this purity event is really hard to access. It's not something that lay people can access. Generally, it takes somebody who has a lot of trainings in regression and trauma healing to be able to work on this. But for my fellow therapists and explorers, it's something that we can talk about if you want more details. Now, after this event, there is the core merging of our biological, all the biological material from the egg and the sperm merges together into a new biological being. At this moment, many, many things happen that are extremely important in terms of spiritual and psychological well-being and our sense of identity. So we call this event joint forces in glory. It's a peculiar term, but that's actually the life command that we receive in that moment. In that moment, it's as if life tells you everything has to merge and to join and to become one, and there's a sense of glory about it. This event is extremely important for several peak states of consciousness. Mainly the twin brains are merging in that moment, so it's a key moment for fusion states, especially some things that we use in our inner peace process, but also in other processes. And when this event happens correctly, there's a feeling of unity and accomplishment. And it's really reminding people of the mythological or archetypal element of it is something that we would call a royal wedding. What is a royal wedding? Well, it's the perfect union of the highest good, the highest, the more pure, the more positive, the strongest representation of our values, right? That's what we mean by when we call it a royal wedding. So it's not about the negative side of royalty or whatever. It's really about what happens when things are optimal, when it feels extremely glorious. And there's a feeling of glory that you can experience if you heal that moment, and a sense of unity and accomplishment, because that's when you really become you. And it feels like everything that has to happen in order for you to exist as an individual being now is coming together and finalizing this union. So it feels extremely agreeable and extremely uplifting. It feels like a royal wedding. That's how it feels when you heal that moment. And this healing part is something that is part of our inner peace process. So it's a really important event. Now, just simultaneously or slightly after this event, and we're talking about seconds here, there is a moment we call the ball of light moment. So at this moment, it feels like there's a ball of light that descends from the skies It's like a lightning strikes and it brings you something inside the core of your new being. And in our model, in our understanding of psychobiology, this ball of light contains consciousness. In our model, consciousness has a physical element to it that we call the center of awareness material. And it's something that seems to be crystalline in nature. So biologically, there's a crystal that comes in as the center of our being, but spiritually, it feels like your soul is coming into the body. So it's really the conception moment where the soul comes into the body. That's how it feels actually. So many people in many traditions consider that conception is really the start of our life, of our existence as a soul on the material plane. Now, from what we know in subcellular psychobiology and peak states, it's actually partially true because our consciousness is already something that is actually present in the sperm and the egg in some way. But certainly in that moment of conception, it's really when things get together and it's really a moment where we are really in there. We are really in our body. Now we are this body. So it's an important event from the point of view of the psyche and the body becoming one thing that's completely united. So if there are traumas at this moment, well, probably there's going to be trauma between our body and our psyche. And so we have this perception that we are a soul inside of a body. Now, in peak states, we actually believe that this is a traumatic perception of things and that we should be so united that we shouldn't have the sense that we are a soul inside a body. We should sense that the soul and the body are one. But that's a rare peak state. Now, what happens at the completion of this conception process, the last stage is a feeling of death and annihilation. Because to become really you in a unique, the most profound uniqueness of yourself, the egg and the sperm have to let go of their identities because they carry some identity, right? So the sperm feels that it's masculine, it's coming from your father. The egg feels like it's a feminine part of your mother. They have to abandon it and to lose it for the complete fusion to happen. And this is extremely traumatic in everybody, virtually everybody, because it feels like death and annihilation. So annihilation is like death, but it's even worse than death in the sense that when you're annihilated, it's as if you never existed before. There's no memory of you. There is nothing left. So it's extremely hard to complete this process positively and trauma-free. But when you do, then you can experience a sense of rebirth and becoming really you. So people who access and heal this event experience this death and rebirth experience, which is a very important pattern in spiritual growth, death and rebirth. But that's probably the moment where it's the most important. So when the rebirth happens, you really feel that you exist. You, the real you, who you are at the core of the essence of your being. And it's an extremely important moment for certain peak states, especially for beauty way. Now, after that, it's the start of your life. So there's an event where something appears in ourselves that we call the life path. And the life path is like a road or a path that is going to guide you in your life into what you're supposed to do, your true dreams and goals in life. Some people would say it's a moment where your life mission starts somehow. We don't really see it as a life mission, but as a path. And this path, if things happen optimally, should be bright and golden. And it should feel not glorious, but it should feel extremely positive. And when you are on your right or your optimal life path, it gives a sense of euphoria and optimism and that things are going perfectly well as they should be. as if you're doing the right thing at the right moment in the right place. So it's a really strong and positive experience that starts at this moment. After that, you're going to have many different stages of development. So you have the first cell division. From one cell, you become 2 cells, then 4 cells, then 8, 16, and so on and so on. You become a blastocyte, which is a pack of many cells. And then you have implantation, when this blastocyte implants itself in the womb wall, and then you become an embryo, and then you have the rest of pregnancy. So many important steps that also have a lot of psychological implications and in terms of peak states of consciousness too, but I cannot go into the details here because it will be too long. Now, if we conclude with a reflection on mythological archetypes, so many traditions and cultures experience this conception, underlying structure of our psychology as something that is explained or told in archetypes or in myth. So if you think about it, there are many different stories that replay this event and are reminiscent of conception. For example, in the West, we have this idea of the princess being in a high tower and the charming prince, which is brave and noble, and it has to slay the dragon to get to the princess and rescue her. So, that's romantic and fantasized idea, but that's actually something that matches some parts of conception. So the sperm has to be strong, it has a lot of obstacles to go through, it has to slay the dragon, so it has to explore the unknown and the chaos of this journey and this environment. And when it does, then it can rescue or actually meet the princess. And the princess is waiting in a high tower, and that's the perception that we can have from the point of view of the sperm. When we know where we have to go, it feels like a journey, but it feels like we're going upward and we have to meet her there, and it's complicated. And the princess, all she wanted is for the sperm to move forward and come toward her, right? So this myth is a replay of conception. Now, we talked about Virgin Mary and the Immaculate Conception before, so it's very important in the Christian religion because probably this is a way to experience peak states of consciousness, and especially some of the peak states that are at the foundation of the spiritual side of this religion. So when we can have a much better conception, where our conception is free from traumas, there's a sense of purity and of unconditional good that happens. And when it happens, then we have a spiritual experience that can be extremely strong. The idea of a royal wedding is also something that matches an experience that we have at conception. So that's why in our tradition, in Europe at least, but also in many other countries like in Asia and so on, the royal wedding is a huge event for the people because it's the concrete realization as a group, as a collective, a nation, for example, of achieving something for the higher good. And when we have this royal wedding, it really has a spiritual backside or these underlying ideas that to achieve the higher good, we have to make things perfect and we have to represent them in the perfect way. So wedding is a ritual, and this ritual is actually not just for kings and queens, but every time somebody has a wedding. If you think about it, wedding is one of the most ancient and important traditions in humans, not just in our civilization, but actually most civilizations. Why? Because we know that wedding is a replay of conception and that it carries a lot of value and a lot of meaning. That's the accomplishment of our most powerful drive, right? Now we can talk more about wedding and why it's important in our traditions. It's not random. It's because wedding is one of the most important human traditions in some way, because it ensures a lot of positive things afterward. Now, we kind of, in our culture, things changed recently in the last few decades, but there is still this underlying drive for most people to find a partner with whom to have a good relationship, whether you're married or not. That's because we want intimacy and we want this merging of the masculine and the feminine to happen so we can experience life at the fullest. Now, it's also echoing the quest that we have for oneness. So many people have this quest for union, for oneness, for harmony, for wholeness. And we know subconsciously that in order to become whole, we have to be in peace and in harmony with other people. And it happens at the individual layer of existence, but also at the collective layer of existence, where there is this quest for union and harmony and coming together. Now, very often, it's actually distorted by traumas. As we can see in our cultures, oneness and wholeness are not really things that are given. It's quite the opposite. But inside of us, we have this quest and this underlying drive that we're trying to recreate this union. And you can see it in mythology, you can see it in movies, especially the movies that are the most popular. They very often carry this quest of achieving this wholeness. In one way or another, beneath every good story, there is this mythological or spiritual element of achieving something that has the highest possible meaning. So that's what I mean by the quest for meaning. The meaning that we're looking for is replaying the meanings that we already have in our biology and especially in conception. Now, if we look at other cultures and other spiritual traditions, you very often have this merging of the masculine and the feminine being seen as the pinnacle of the human experience. So, for example, in the Hindu tradition, you have these gods, Shiva and Shakti, which represents the masculine and the positive, and these myths are actually a guide to the human spiritual evolution. Because in India, you know that this spiritual tradition is not just about understanding the myth, but it's about practicing things that will help you achieve this. For example, through meditation or yoga or other Hindu practices. It's also underlying in India. It's also an underlying idea in Buddhism, even if it's not the most forthcoming. So this idea is that in order to become a fully realized human being, you have to harmonize and merge your masculine and positive sides inside of yourself as an individual, right? Also, the idea of the phoenix in our tradition is simply a symbol for death and rebirth. So in order to be reborn and to grow, very often we have to go through death first and annihilation. So we have to burn. We have to burn in flame and become ashes and become nothing in order to become reborn. So there are many developmental events before birth where these death and rebirth patterns happen, but conception is certainly one of the most important ones. Okay, so now let's talk about how it impacts the psychology of men and women, and it does a lot. So first of all, in general, if you are a man, you would have the tendency to identify yourself with the sperm. So in this presentation before, when I was talking about the sperm, maybe you felt a bit more involved, and I was talking about the egg, you felt less involved. And the reverse, if you identify as a woman, then you probably were more concerned about the egg's fate rather than what happens to the sperm. That's because we have this tendency to identify to the masculine or to the feminine side of ourselves more or less. Everybody's different, of course, so that's a general idea. Now, the reality is that both men and women have a masculine and a feminine polarity. What it means is that inside of us, we are made of half of our biological material come from a mother and the other from a father. And at conception, they merge, and of course, we choose a certain sex biologically at that moment. But we keep having this psychological elements of the masculine and the feminine. They are both inside of us. And that means that both men and women have both sides. It's like the yin and the yang, right? We have both, and everyone contains the other one. So that's why there's a spectrum of polarity between masculine and feminine, and we can move on that spectrum, but that's basically the idea. And men and women have much more similarities and differences. I thought it was important to say that because you can just polarize the conceptions that you have about genders and sex and relationship in society. But if you look at it from a broader perspective, we actually have so many similarities, and since we can tap into this masculine side or feminine side that every one of us has, we can use it to understand the other person's point of view. And if you want to have a happy relationship, for example, in your wedding, for example, well, you will have to understand the other person's point of view and what they're experiencing. And your ability to tap into the other side, the other polarity within yourself, will help you to create this harmony with the people you live with, right? And what it means at a deeper level is that the integration of both polarities is necessary for a full integration of the self. And what it means is that if you want to be an accomplished human being, you have to recognize in yourself that you have both sides. Even if you're a man, you don't have only masculine traits, you have some feminine traits. And reverse, if you're a woman, you have mostly feminine traits maybe, or mostly you have a balance of both, or maybe you have a little bit of masculine trait, maybe you have a lot, it doesn't matter. But you have both polarities. And if you want to separate them and make them be in conflict, you will experience this conflict within yourself, and you will experience it in your life. So more difficulties and more misery. While if you integrate both polarities and you recognize that every one of us is made of both, including you, then you will be able to create more harmony within yourself and then in the outside world too. So it's not uncommon, it's actually the general rule that people have projections. And what we call projections are generalized ideas about certain type of people in the range of they're irritating, or I want to blame those kind of people. Like these kind of people are really irritating to me. And we make projections on all kind of things, all kind of topics and all kind of themes. But one that is really important is against the other sex, right? And why do we have that? Well, because we have this feminine side and this masculine side that are supposed to merge and combine themselves at conception. But because there are traumas in this moment, and because we identify more as a sperm or as the egg, then we'll have the tendency to relieve those traumas as conflicts that we project on the people from the other sex. So for example, you probably have met many women who told you, all men are this or this or that. I won't say insults here, but generally there's an insult. But it could be some things like all men are selfish, or all men are violent, or all men are arrogant, or untrustworthy, etc., etc. So you will have this idea that all men are like this, and there's a negative quality about all men. Or the reverse, there's a negative quality about all women. All women are like this, all women are like that, and you blame them for something bad, and you put them all in the same category. And that's actually because you have a conflict within yourself with your own polarity. But instead of feeling it within yourself, which is painful, you project it outward. And so you see all male or all female are as bad people or irritating or having certain characteristics that you dislike because of those traumas. So those projections are generally due to conception trauma, mostly. And of course, the egg represents the woman or the feminine side, and the sperm represents the masculine side or man. So if we go deeper into what it means, well, men tend to be very attracted to the feminine, of course, because this masculine part of us wants to reach the feminine part. And yet, people who have more masculine traits tends to be having all these traumas playing out in their life. So men tend to be very attracted, yet having an intense fear of commitment or deep intimacy. We want to conquer women, but when we are winning and we're getting to this phase where we are getting into the deep harmony and deep intimacy, we freak out. And that's because we have those sperm traumas. On the other side, women are very attractive to the masculine, and they often seek commitment because women know that there are many sperms available, but there's only one that they really need. And if they do merge with it, then they will be, the egg will become something better. So it replaces in our dating life. We know that when we really get intimate with somebody that is has a complementary polarity to us, then we will become something greater. That's kind of the spirituality of our relationships. But those traumas are playing out and preventing us from experiencing a better harmony and a better satisfaction. So both men and women, both masculine and feminine, seek safety in the relationship and validation. Because those traumas are so intense and they can include rejection, disgust, merging issues, physical issues merging. If we don't experience safety in the relationship, then we will get triggered into those fears and those deep, painful feelings. Therefore, if you want to create a good harmony in your couple or in general in society, then you need to provide safety and validation to the other person. Sometimes it feels like a lot, but it's the only way for the other person to feel safe. So when you're having an argument, for example, with your husband or your woman, and you really try to get your point across, you have to understand that the argument will never go in a good direction if you don't feel safe or if the other person doesn't feel safe. So you have to make the other person feel safe in order for the argument to lead to something. But if you are angry, for example, and if you express some aggressiveness and make the person feel unsafe, well, it will be more difficult for them to be open to any idea, right? So if you want to resolve conflicts, you have to respect the other person's safety. Make sense? And now moving on, breaking out can be very painful. Yes, of course, because breaking out replaces those traumas of rejection, and merging is difficult, and not getting the right one, and not getting to the right person, and all these traumas can get triggered, and so there's a lot of sadness, but also physical pain can be really present in breaking out. Now, marriage is one of the most fundamental human traditions. I already said that. Why? Because it's related to this powerful drive. This is how we create life, right? So marriage has been a tradition in most human civilizations across many, many different religions and spiritual systems because it's universal. Most people recognize that this bonding of the masculine and the feminine not only is a source of life, but also carries a deeper level of accomplishment in terms of spiritual self-realization. So that's why it's one of the most important traditions that we have wherever you live in the world. Basically, you have this tradition of marriage, right? Now, many people are looking for wholeness and completion through romantic relationship because, we have this drive, this biological drive of the masculine and the feminine having to meet and merge, become one, and become something greater. And that's what we are often trying to accomplish in our life, within ourselves and also outside. So within ourselves, we are trying to make sense of who we are and what we want to do and the different traits that we have. Sometimes we have qualities and flaws that we're trying to balance. And I guess that's everyone's quest in life, to become better, to have a better life and be a good person having a good life. So we are looking for, how can I grow? How can I become even better? And the underlying theme mostly is we're trying to create this wholeness and completion within ourselves and to resolve the conflicts that we have within ourselves. When a part of us wants something, but the other part wants something else, when there's a goal that we really want to achieve, but something else says no and stops us and hinders us from moving forward, we have all these conflicts that we're trying to resolve in our lives. And we're trying to resolve them internally and in relationships. Now, we can also talk about psychopathology of conception. So that's the relationship between diseases and the psychology of this specific moment. Now, we're talking more about research topics here and research endeavors because all the things are not especially proven or verified, or we cannot always have applications from that, but these are just research ideas to keep in mind, especially for my fellow researchers. So here are some research topics linked to conception. Many sexual disorders and relationship troubles are actually one of the same thing, because we have traumas around the representation of the masculine or the feminine, and of course it plays out when we get intimate. So sexual disorders might be triggered by conception traumas, and that means if we understand better how conception works and how the different phases work, maybe we can have easier, faster, more reliable solutions for many sexual disorders. Now, it's been my idea, I don't know if you will agree with me or not, but it's one of my theories that people-pleasing behavior is often the result of the conflict between being accepted by the other sex and revealing your own flaws. And so, because you feel that you're going to be rejected if you really present yourself, then you mask, or you people please, or you do something to mask your own flaws and negativities because you want the other person to accept you. Otherwise, there's this underlying fear of dying, right? Because the sperm dies or the egg will die if they don't meet. And so maybe we can change this people-pleasing behavior and help people be more authentic and free and safe by working on these rejection issues at conception. So an extension of that would be the nice guy syndrome, or issues like voluntarily submission, manipulation, etc. So thinking about Stockholm syndrome, for example, why would somebody submit themselves to somebody aggressive? Well, they want to stay safe, they want to survive, right? Maybe that's not only linked to conception, but maybe there's a lot of things happening at that moment that are especially strategic to work on. Now, hysteria is another topic. Like I said before, there's an hysteria scream at conception. And hysteria, even though it's really uncommon in nowadays in our society, hysteria generally have a very sexualized component to it. So maybe it's linked to conception, I don't know, but that would be an hypothesis to test. And of course, putting attractive people on a pedestal. So where there's rejection between the egg and the sperm, one of them has to make the move, right? And still move forward. So when you see somebody as very attractive, then you think, wow, this person has a great potential for reproduction. So I'd better, admire that person or want to be with that person, etc., etc. And that's why attractive people have a halo effect. So the halo effect is, you would have the tendency to believe that certain people are more competent or skilled or smart because they are beautiful, physically beautiful, right? And that's why we have this underlying idea that the more something is beautiful, the more the other person is beautiful, the more value they have. So there's a value issue here, and inferiority and superiority complex might be tracked to this moment, amongst other moments, of course. Anyway, those are just research ideas. If we move to psychoimmunology, I don't know if I'm going to talk about it in details, but we are doing research on diseases that can be transmitted from parents to gametes. So gametes is egg or sperm. So that means that before you're even conceived, you can be infected by pathogens such as bacteria, viruses, and other pathogens. And they can infect at many different stages of development. So ovulation and the sperm release moments are very important moments in terms of immunology. We've seen that when the egg releases and starts the journey in the fallopian tube, there can be many infections starting at that stage. Same thing for the sperm. When the sperm is released and goes through the sperm canal, there's a potential for being infected by pathogens present in those places. Now, just before conception, the vaginal fluids and the womb itself can contain pathogens. They are generally considered to be symbiotic pathogens in normal human beings. We call it the vaginal flora. However, maybe they are dangerous to the sperm and the egg. Maybe they play a role in infertility, for example. I don't know if there are many studies on this topic, but if there's a dysbiosis in the vaginal areas and the womb, maybe this has an impact on fertility. Anyway, at conception, especially, there's an opportunity for pathogens to jump in, and they create a lot of problems. And I won't go into details, but we've seen empirically that there are many different pathogens that can infect us in that moment. So that creates even more trauma and difficulties. And of course, if the egg carries some diseases, or if the sperm carries some diseases, when they merge, they keep those diseases, unfortunately. They don't get rid of it. Maybe they would if the purity events that I talked about was completely trauma-free, but in our experience, that hasn't been possible to create this. So unfortunately, they do share the diseases. And then you can have other opportunities for pathogens to infect us all the way to implantation, and maybe even later. Conception traumas can be worsened or lightened by the presence or absence of traumas on earlier events. So that means that the egg and the sperm have their own history, right? They come from somewhere and they had different stages through the journey. And depending on if they had traumas in those moments, those traumas will carry on and worsen conception or make it even more complicated or not. So sometimes it's strategic to work on these earlier events. So for example, ovulation and spermatogenesis, like I said, are very important events. So when the egg is released and when the sperm are released, there might be traumas in those moments that makes it more difficult for them to move through the journey. Now, even before that, eggs and sperms are made from pre-organelles. They are like very, very small micro cells. They're not really complete cells, but they're pre-organelles. So they're like biological bricks that get together, and we have 7 on each side. We call them the twin brains. There's a reason for that is explained in other videos, but there's a moment where those 7 bricks get together and they coalesce, they merge together. And if they have traumas in those moments, you can also experience projection because there are conflicts. The conflict traumas are projected outward. So if you have traumas in those mergings, you might have trauma in the merging of the egg and the sperm because these are 2 biological parts merging together. So they might replace the coalescence traumas. So maybe if we heal coalescence, conception will be better. Of course, even before that, each of these organelles, each of those brains, as we call them, has an origin and developmental sequence. So you can have pathogens that infect those very early developmental events for the every 7 brains of the egg or the sperm. So when they arrive at conception, they have all this toxic load, so to speak, and they might seem dirty or impure to the corresponding other. So of course, if you clean them of all these pathogens before, then conception will probably get easier. But how does it work exactly? That's a research topic. It's fairly complicated. And each of those pre-organelles, each brain, can hold a false identity. So often they will take the identity of the parent or the grandparents, right? Because our biological material come from our parents. But if those biological parts believe that they are the parent or the grandparents, instead of becoming a new individual, at conception it makes it even harder to have this death and rebirth event where you really become yourself. Instead, you partially become yourself, but there are parts of your biology that stay stuck on reproducing your parents or your grandparents patterns, psychologically and biologically. Another thing that can go wrong is at conception, when the egg opens itself, it might open itself to the sperm in the wrong location. So it can be in the chest, in the belly, in the head. We've seen it happening all over the place, and it makes things even more complicated. Now, if we talk about peak states of consciousness, which is, our main research study from the foundation of the Institute, where we've seen that many important peak states are related to conception. Especially the beauty wave state is a state where you experience only positivity and positive emotions, and you see experience as being a fundamentally, unconditionally positive and beautiful experience. And in that state, you dissociate yourself from all negativity. You only align yourself with what's good. So it's a very, very important state from our point of view. The optimal relationship state is also probably linked to the moment where the masculine and the feminine merge into something new. And the optimal relationship state is something that most people are looking for in their relationship, but never really getting to it completely. It's a quest for most couples to reach that state. That state is defined by the fact that you never have an argument, you're always good with the other person, you feel supported, even if the person is not there, you feel that connection. There's a sense of awe and admiration and attraction that is everlasting. It's like the perfect relationship, really. So you cannot really have this relationship that is perfect if conception has a lot of traumas, if that makes sense. You replace those traumas, like I said before. Now, twin-brain fusion states also happen at conception. They happen also before. There are different stages that are important. But for example, our inner peace process, which is a process that gives us this state of peace and not being activated by past events, negative past events, but staying in the present emotionally, it's a very nice state, is a state of merging for the egg, for the heart brain and the mind brain. So those brain fuses at conception. Our inner peace process is based on that. But I guess that the conception event is important for all fusion states because, of course, all brains are merging. Now, we don't have derived a process for all the other fusion states, but if you want to know more about them, you can read about them on the website. And then conception might be important for other very nice peak states. For example, we've experienced gratitude to happen at the moment where the egg and the sperm meet. Immunity, of course, might also be linked to conception. Now, it's a very, very complex thing to work on because, as I said, you can have pathogens, infection at many, many different stages of the biological development. But conception is one of the most important events. So this is something that we are still exploring to this day. Now, I've talked a little bit about the spiritual meaning of conception. So the spiritual meaning is, why is love and romance so important to humans? Well, like I said, not only does it obey the biological drive to perpetuate the human race, but we intuitively know that the deepest states of meaning, accomplishment, joy, ecstasy, awakening, self-actualization, call it whatever you want, but those states of the highest human experience, the highest good, are linked to this male and female integration at conception. And because we have this underlying psychology of trying to reach those states, we're trying to be happier, but more than happier, we try to find meaning. And we're really looking to experience those extremely positive states. And that's why love and romance is so important for us in general. Depending, it's different for everybody, of course, but it's something that drives us. Just listen to how many love songs there are, how much romance is portrayed in movies and theaters and books, and it's such an important topic that we talk about again and again and again. We've been talking about love and romance for as long as stories exist, right? Because we understand that the more we integrate the male and the female polarity within us and in the outer life, in the outside life, the more we can reach and create a better path for ourselves and also for our children to reach those higher states. So the spiritual meaning of conception is that at this moment we have the basis, the psychological and spiritual basis for some of the most important spiritual experiences that we can have as human beings. And therefore, if conception happened with traumas, in our life we are going to replace those traumas, but also try to overcome them. And it's a quest in and of itself to research how we can heal conception even more so that we can experience those states in the present and for the future of humanity. What about sexuality? Yeah, of course it's linked to conception, because conception feels sexual. So it might seem odd that the sperm and the egg experience sexuality, but if you really regress and experience those moments and go back to those moments, you will feel it. And it's one of those special moments where we can link spirituality and sexuality. Actually, they should be linked. So sexuality can be really shallow, or it can be incredibly spiritual. And you have a spiritual tradition that is based on that called Tantra, which is one of the very ancient roots of yoga and the Hindu religion. And in Tantra, you use sexuality to reach spiritual experiences and to grow spiritually. And it's something that I guess most people experience in their wedding, in their sexual life, where the partners, throughout the years, your sexuality change, and you evolve into something that is less about the pleasures of, basic pleasures, I would say, but it's more related to something deeper, something from a highest order. So you're trying to reach the spiritual experience of intimacy. So if you look at your own sexuality, you can also find room for improvement, right? We all do. So is the sexual act an opportunity to celebrate life and to share joy with your partner? Or is it filled with shame and guilt? Is it joyful and playful? Or do you experience self-restriction and limits and judgment and negativity? Is it linked to something positive, or is it linked to all these subconscious collective negativity that exists around it? The more you free yourself from this negativity, the more you can experience the positive sides of it and grow from it. Sexuality is linked to creativity, because the sexual energy in and of itself, outside of just the sexual act, but the sexual energy is an energy that exists in human beings and in other beings actually, to create. It's the energy of creating something new. Because at conception, we create something new, we create a new being, something unique that never existed before. And that plays out in the way we experience our creativity in all areas of our life. It's as if the capacity of creativity itself is linked to how we experience sexuality. So the more you free yourself on a sexual level for any traumas, any negativity, the more you might experience creativity in your life on many different levels. And by embracing your sexual nature, you allow yourself to recognize your best self. So what I mean by that is that we are sexual creators. And it has been locked down under a lot of morals and rules and a lot of moral issues, especially through the different layers of civilization and the history, and religions, of course, have been trying to build a path that is really, I would say narrow, but I would say defined of what is acceptable and what is not. But in doing so, it creates a lot of pressure and negativity. So shame and guilt, for example, and also other negative emotion, eventually get linked to sexuality. But the more you free yourself from that, the more you heal those emotions And the more you can embody the fact that you are a complete being, you are both masculine and feminine, you are both spiritual and sexual, the more you can integrate everything and make everything work in harmony, and the better you can experience your best self, right? So you can become better in different areas of your life. Because you have more freedom and more union within yourself, you can use your abilities. So creativity, or feeling that you're strong and powerful in a good way, in a positive way, in a way that is not to the detriment of other people, but actually to the service of building something with other people. And the more you can be inside your body, which is also in and of itself, it's a goal in and of itself. So, traumas around conception play out in our current life. Relationship, sexuality, the integration of yourself as a grown-up, individualized person, etc., etc. There's also a lot of potential for psychoimmunology research in this time zone, and it's a key to fundamental states of psychological and biological and even spiritual well-being. So very, very important to study conception in our work. So, as a conclusion to all of this, if you want a happy life, heal your conception. So, for example, you can start with projections. Write a list of all the things that men are and that women are. And you can use the projection technique. It's a technique that we teach for free. So you can use it, try it, and you can start healing your conception by healing those conflicts between the masculine and the feminine part of yourself. You can also search in yourself for the masculine sensation and the feminine sensation, and feel in yourself all those sides in competition or conflict. Is one of them being completely stumped and dominated by the other one? Or am I switching all the time? Or what's happening on that side? It's very interesting to analyze and feel into that, etc., etc. I hope this presentation gives you ideas, insights, and maybe questions. So let's exchange about it. If you want to, you can drop a comment below this video. And if you want to work on conception, we have different things that we can provide in our professional services, whether myself or my colleagues, of course. For example, projections is something we can work on. The inner peace process is something that works at conception, and some other things. So don't hesitate to reach out if you feel like it would be a good idea for you to explore this topic and increase your quality of life by working on conception. And to conclude this very long video, the idea is make love, not war. And I choose this yin-yang symbol to represent the fact that we are supposed to be united, even if we're different. And it's true for men and women. It's true for people from different nationalities or origins. It's true for all humanity. We have a lot of differences, but we have more similarities. And we have within ourselves the same elements that different people also have within themselves. Just like the yin and yang have, they have themselves, they have each other within themselves. So, I wish you the best. Thank you for watching, and I'd be happy to hear any feedback or comments that you have. Make love, not war. Have a good life, and take care. Thank you.